I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, as we consider political free speech across a number of episodes, we look particularly at Islamophobia. And my guest today is Dr Salman Al-Azami from Liverpool Hope University.
After the famous burqa comments by Boris Johnson, when he said that those who wear the burqa are like letterboxes and bank robbers. So there was a direct report by Till Mama, which reports anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim attacks, not only racism attacks. The abuse towards Muslims increased by 375% in the week following that article by Boris Johnson. So you can see the direct consequences of the way the terminologies are used.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders.
I know people at home are fed up with politics. I hear you, and I want to be honest with you. We have not been good enough, and we need to be better.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
It's a bit like noticing that someone has a verbal tic. At first, you hardly notice it. Then you do. Then you find yourself waiting for it to come. Of course, nobody should be blamed for having verbal tics, but ideological tics are now very much part of the sound of politics. At first, you hear them talking about all these Muslims and the imposition of Sharia law and London not looking like London anymore. And then you notice it coming up in every conversation, in every context. And finally, you know it's coming, like a tired cliche blurting out from the mouth of a pub bore. It's not exactly a phobia, but it's phobia-like insofar as it tells you more about the fear and loathing of the speaker than the subject of their speech. I've met people who seem to be obsessed by the presence of Muslims as some kind of threat to white Christian society. They can't stop talking about it. It's like a compulsion. Islamophobia has become an ugly aspect of contemporary political discourse. But it hasn't emerged out of thin air any more than old hatreds of the Irish or Jews just came to people as a passing thought. It is to the promoters of these bad ideas that we should be looking. And two interesting studies have cast light on the production of Islamophobia. In December 2024, the Centre for Media Monitoring published a study entitled GB News, a snapshot of anti-Muslim hatred. The report shows how the GB News channel persistently refers to Muslims in negative terms. And it concludes by stating that, I quote, GB News has an excessive, almost obsessive focus on Muslims and regularly demonises their beliefs and practices. Programmes rarely have Muslim contributors, and its stories about Islam and Muslims are overwhelmingly negative, more so than any other channel. Presenters and anchors have openly declared Muslims in general, and the number of Muslims in the UK in particular, to be a problem. GB News frequently portrays Muslims as a Trojan horse seeking to undermine British society and suggests that they're working to impose Sharia law in the UK. Now, you might say that this is only to be expected from a far-right propaganda channel which is primarily aimed at an audience that wants to remain permanently fearful and livid. For GB News, Muslims have become placeholders for all that is out of control and frightening about society. They're a verbal tic that accompanies a sense of intense hopelessness. Whenever I turn over to GB News for a few seconds, I play a little game with myself to see how long it will take before they negatively mention Muslims. And I rarely have to stay on the channel for long before the obsession surfaces. A person who is obsessed by the cracks between the paving stones will constantly notice them, adjusting their movements to what seems to be a blatant chasm in the earth they stand upon. GB News does little to conceal its frenzied appeal to the crack seekers. But what about Britain's oldest political magazine, The Spectator, traditionally respected for its thoughtful right-of-centre analysis? Its former political editor, Peter Oborne, has recently written about how The Spectator has become obsessed with attacking Muslims. He says, I quote, "I don't think The Spectator can be accused of directly provoking violence against Muslims. Its genteel and middle-class readers might be further enraged by the inflammatory rhetoric of Spectator writers, but they are not usually street-fighting thugs. Instead, the magazine has played a role in making racism and bigotry permissible across much mainstream British media and wider public and political discourse. This means that The Spectator plays a particularly significant and pernicious role in fomenting Islamophobia," unquote. That's Peter Oborne, the previous political editor of The Spectator. And his words should cause some deep reflection in The Spectator's editorial office. Of course, they're free to publish what they want within the law, but shouldn't free speech in a democracy amount to rather more than the right to cultivate obsessions in the minds of readers in search of a minority to blame and attack? Islamophobia, like anti-Semitism, starts with a verbal tick, but soon grows into a threatening shout, staining political discourse with its facile bigotry. The sound of politics would be much less tense and paranoid without the tone, the tick, the trick of carping prejudice. I say this as someone who is not a Muslim and enjoys the liberty to criticise all religion, ethno-nationalism and racism in all its forms. Islamophobia is clearly not an argument about theology. It's an attack upon neighbours, a mean gesture of political inhospitality. To discuss this further, let me turn to my guest, Dr Salman Al-Azami, who is Senior Lecturer in Language, Media and Communication at the School of Humanities at Liverpool Hope University, who's written widely about the representation of Muslims in the media. Salman Al-Azami, it is very good to have you here today on The Sound of Politics. We spend quite a lot of time thinking about words and making sure that words are mutually intelligible so that people can have meaningful political conversations. So I want to start with a very basic question, which is, what does it mean, Salman, to speak of Islamophobia? Where did this term originate and what does it describe?
Okay, thank you for having me. The Islamophobia has deep link with, if you go back, with Orientalism, colonialism, in terms of superiority of one group over another. And that's where, in terms of how people of the other, we talk about othering, so how other people are looked at. And if you look at Orientalism, Edward Said's classic work, Orientalism, what he tries to talk about is how the Europeans who called themselves Occident looked at the Orient, the East, and the Islamic world were exotic but weird. And in that way, the representation of, in terms of what we say, a very famous African novelist, Chimamanda Adichie, gave a very powerful speech once calling it The Danger of a Single Story, talking about one group of people or one culture and say that this is everything. So these are the backgrounds. But you can see that the first time the terminology started to be used in the 1920s, but that was a time when, in terms of criticizing European Orientalists' distorted interpretation of Islam. And that was sort of an early 20th century. We see that sort of a period of clash between Christian Europe and Islamic Orient. And that's how the colonial power in Islam were brought into the forefront of political rhetoric.
I assume from what you're saying there that what we are talking about is a sort of rather vague and generalized othering, which doesn't actually specifically take into account the meaning of the religion or culture of Islam. Islamophobia, as such, is not a religious critique, but a broad attempt to exclude people.
Yes, and the terminology Islamophobia got the most momentum in the late 1990s when the Runnymede Trust first gave that definition. So it gave that definition in 1997, calling Islamophobia a useful shortened way of referring to dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. Now, there is a problem, as you were just referring to, in terms of the religion. So how do we talk about religion and the people? So criticism of religion is everyone's right. So there should not be, and one of the ways those who don't like the term Islamophobia try to say that, Islamophobia is sort of having a blasphemy law, that you cannot criticize a religion. And this particular definition had the term Islam in it, which they later, in 2017, realized it and moved it to say that anti-Muslim discrimination rather than talking about religion. And Tariq Maudud actually was the first person to pick up and they say that actually in the West, if you talk about Islamophobia in the West, it stems from cultural racism. There is a racist element in it. And there have been a lot of discussion among scholars in recent times in terms of what is the best definition. Now, the terminology-wise, this is not the great terminology in the sense. It can be acknowledged that when you use the term Islamophobia, the word Islam counts, not the people. But it's not about the terminology, it's about what it means. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group, APPG on British Muslims, came out with this definition in 2018. And this is where a lot of academics, including myself, we endorsed this. And majority of the political parties at that time, even the Labour Party at that time, endorsed it. So this definition says Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Here what we see in terms of, for example, one of the first victims of 9/11 in America was a Sikh gentleman because he had turban and beard. And Sikh gentlemen still continue to face Islamophobic attack. So because the way people look, so for example, the most attacked group of people, Islamophobic attacks, are hijabi Muslim women. Because, you can say there are quite a few layers. She is a woman, she is Muslim, she wears the hijab. And if you are black hijabi Muslim women, you are targeted the most.
Right.
So you can see that there is a very strong interrelationship between racism and Islamophobia in terms of, they look Muslim. Whether they are Muslim or not, whether they practice Islam or not, it is immaterial. So you can attack them.
That's a really helpful and broad definition. So my next question, I guess, is how widespread is Islamophobia in contemporary political discourse? For example, in a country like Britain. I'm asking you not for a particular set of figures about how widespread it is, but is it a very generalized problem? Is it a minority of the population who could be characterized as being Islamophobic? But also, I'm interested in the distinction between tacit and explicit Islamophobia. That is to say, the kind of people who are openly racist and the kind of people who act on a sort of intuitive racism because that's part of their attitude.
Yeah, I will start with the way the politicians, particularly people in government, treated the term Islamophobia and having a definition of Islamophobia. So, for example, we have a IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been enshrined in law, and then of course it is easier to prosecute people, and we have definitions that allow us to rightfully look at anti-Semitism. The problem with the governments, for example, when the Tory government never accepted that Islamophobia is a term. They never accepted that the terminology is right.
Yeah.
Though when we came out with this definition, at that time, Boris Johnson was probably doing in sort of having the leadership contest with Jeremy Hunt. And he was, during the contest, he said that we will come out with a definition of Islamophobia. And they did appoint someone called Kari Asim to come up with that. But later on, 3 years on, they never had any communication. He was knocking them, they never contacted, and nothing happened. And then they suddenly said that this guy had been sacked for whatever, whether he said something or tweeted something or whatever.
Right. Just to be clear, I don't want to interrupt you, I want you to carry on, but just to be clear, would you like there to be a law rather like the law relating to anti-Semitism to exist in relation to Islamophobia? Would that be helpful, do you think?
That would be very helpful. And that is what we have been fighting for. Because in that way, you can define a certain type of crime as Islamophobic, and it is easier to prosecute. Because if you make it as general hatreds, what this Labour government recently did, I don't know if you are aware of, they made a definition called anti-Muslim hatred. Now, Islamophobia, whether you like the terminology or not, as I said, terminology might be a bit confusing, but anti-Semitism is also confusing because the Arabs are also Semites. But we all accept anti-Semitism as racial hatred towards the Jews. So in that way, we can accept Islamophobia if we have a definition which says that Islamophobia has nothing to do with Islam as a religion. It's about the way the people are targeted, attacked, abused, physically and verbally. So that would be very helpful. But this government, despite accepting this when they were in opposition, now as they're in government, they refuse to accept Islamophobia as a terminology. And they came out with a definition. And that is a problem. And it is still, there is that, I feel, of course, it's very difficult for me as an academic to come out with a conspiracy theory. I won't do that. But there is a tendency, you can see politically, in terms of the attitude towards immigrants and all, this government, Keir Starmer's government, have tried to move towards the right. And of course, you can see that they wanted to reform. And in that way, accepting Islamophobia and having Islamophobia definition, they might have thought that it might affect their target group or the people they are trying to appease. I can't find any other reason why, if you are giving a definition, why you do not use a term that is worldwide accepted. It is accepted, everyone knows this term. Anti-Muslim hatred is a sort of downgraded type of terminology, and it is not a terminology used anywhere else. So that is the starting point of the politicians, not accepting that there is a terminology called Islamophobia and it should be enshrined in law that this is a type of racism, it should not be accepted.
Okay, that's very clear. Let me ask you a direct question, kind of in three parts. Would you characterize Nigel Farage as being Islamophobic? If so, does that apply to Reform UK as a whole? And if so, does that apply to the people who vote for that party?
Well, I would not go into the extent of saying that everyone who vote for them are Islamophobic, because I don't have evidence for that. But Nigel Farage, definitely, there is a very famous interview he gave to Trevor Phillips in Sky TV, where he said that I see young Muslims, and he categorically talking about young Muslims who don't want to be in this country, who are, against this country, directly saying, and Trevor Phillips was, challenging him, and he repeatedly stuck on that. You asked me particularly about Reform. So, for example, Reform UK Facebook groups, they have a lot of racist far-right posts and Islamophobic conspiracy theories. There are groups set up by Reform UK officials, but contains posts calling for Muslims to be lynched and suggestions that Jewish people are trying to dilute our country with foreign invaders. So, you can see that Nigel Farage has a record of anti-Semitism as well, which now he denies. And this is not exclusive to Reform, but Reform, you can see that even during the last election, there were several Reform candidates. It was exposed how they were talking about Muslims. But this is also with the Conservative Party. There was a survey with the Conservative Party members. 58% said that Islam is a threat to the British way of life. And only 18% believe that the Western way of life and Islam are compatible. Even within the Muslim, Labour Party. So there was a Labour Muslim network. They published the Islamophobia and the Muslim Experience report within the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And reported that half of Muslim Labour Party members said that they did not trust Keir Starmer or the party leadership to address Islamophobia. So you can see that. And of course, Nigel Farage directly said in 2024 that Muslims do not share British values. Whereas if you look at surveys, Muslims and the Sikhs are the highest. Even they outnumber the white British in terms of their loyalty towards Britain.
That is so interesting. Of course, I should say Nigel Farage would deny that he's a racist. And I mean, I guess words and phrases used by politicians and by political activists have implications. And I wonder whether you could kind of talk me through that relationship between rhetoric and its consequences. And I'm not thinking so much here about someone like Farage, but I'm thinking of, Boris Johnson and that idea that it's somehow funny or witty to attack particular minorities, one of which were Muslim women. There's a consequence for doing that, isn't there? Because I think there's another view out there, which is, it's all harmless fun, and why do you get hot under the collar about this? What would you say?
Well, after the famous burqa comments by Boris Johnson, when he said that those who wear the burqa are like letterboxes and bank robbers. So there was a direct report by Tell Mama, which reports anti-Muslim racism, anti-Muslim attacks, not only racism attacks. The abuse towards Muslims increased by 375% in the week following that article by Boris Johnson. So you can see the direct consequences of the way the terminologies are used. And that's why, Baroness Worsey, the first Muslim cabinet minister in Britain, Conservative Party member and a peer, she famously said in 2011, the Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test, which means that, of course, Islamophobia was within this, the dinner table at home, but now it is open goal. You can say anything against Islam and Muslims and you will not be challenged. For example, very recently, the far-right protests organized by Tommy Robinson, and he directly said that Muslims will be kicked out of the country, and there were directly racist things were said. And Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative Party leader, was asked. She was continuously just criticizing the pro-Palestine marches, but she would not call these marches hate march, whereas there were direct hatred. That we would get rid of Muslims. All Muslims have to stop. All mosques will be closed. All Muslims have to leave the country. Directly saying that, still she could not find anything, hate element in that. And she refused to call it a hate march, whereas she kept calling the pro-Palestine marches as hate marches.
You're absolutely right that the way in which the labelling of events has been politicised and weaponised is really troubling and really bad for any kind of democratic debate. And in relation to that, I mean, one of the claims of the far right, perpetuated by major figures like Trump and Musk, is that Muslims are endeavouring to implement Sharia law in parts of the UK. And indeed, they claim that some British cities are already living under Sharia law. What do you say about that? I mean, how do you tackle that sort of nonsense?
It's really, how do you tackle those people who have large mouthpieces? Things like X or President of the United States, the power he has and number of followers he has. You heard the terms commonly coming up, that Islamification. London is called Londonistan. There's always terminologies like Muslim no-go areas. None of them have ever been proved right, but still they call. And let me just put you on the spot, Salman. Have you ever come across Muslims in Britain who say that they want the whole of the country or whole cities to live under Sharia law? Absolutely not. Categorically not. Now, if supposedly one individual at certain parts of the countries says that, it has no meaning whatsoever. I personally never heard anyone say that. But, of course, there are around 4 million Muslims here. You cannot stop anyone from saying anything. Right. But no Muslim groups or no Muslim organization, no mosque, nowhere, because this is nonsense. We are just, what is the percentage, by 6% of the population. Yes, it is growing. It has grown from 4.8% in 2011 to 6% in 2021. But that doesn't mean that there is any form of Islamification taking place. Right. So one of the reasons is that the birth rate. And it is a big issue within the Western context as well, because I've seen a report recently that, we are having less, Western Europe is suffering from, birth rate issues. We are having older population than younger population. So Muslim birth rate is relatively higher. So that could be a reason. But Muslims get along very well. We abide by the law. As far as Muslims are concerned, they are proud citizens of the United Kingdom. Last night, I did not sleep watching England, how well they played. And I was so tensed in the last 20 minutes of the game. I'm not alone.
I think England needed several gods to support them for that match. So I'm glad that all of them were being called upon.
The first word I wrote, I was having text messages with my two sons-in-law. Both of them are actually white British Muslims. And the first thing I wrote after the final whistle is Alhamdulillah, something we say that praise be to God that it has happened. Right. So you can easily see what. So. Yeah. But in terms of terminologies, one of the most serious ones that are being uttered by the politicians and amplified by the media is this Muslim grooming gang thing, rhetoric. As if it is the Muslims who have the monopoly of the grooming. Yes, there have been some Asian Muslim grooming gangs, terrible ones. They are all absolute, they should never be out of the jail. And I was horrified hearing that one of them just gone out of jail. But the thing is this a Muslim monopoly? The Home Office report says more than 80% of the grooming is done by white people. And then after the Epstein files, we really look back and say, shall we say that, because of the Epstein files, we'll say that Jewish grooming gang? Should we say that? So this is why the term Muslim is brought up. And this is always the case. If any perpetrator of crime happens to be a Muslim, that Muslimness has to be mentioned. Otherwise, someone who is a loony and who is just a bad person has done the crime. So this is the problem.
I want to ask you now, I guess it's quite a sensitive question, about the relationship between two forms of hatred, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. In the common sense of that, I guess, anti-Jewish hatred and anti-Islamic hatred.
Yeah.
Do they, in your view, emanate from the same dark place, or are they very different forms of hatred? I mean, they clearly are both forms of hatred. Should we think about them differently, or can we address them commonly in some way?
I think there's a lot of commonalities. If you go back to the earlier times, why were the Jews kicked out of this country from Europe? And which are the places which gave shelter to the Jews? Go back to the Ottoman Empire. They gave shelter to the Jews. And when did the Jews arrive here? After the Second World War. When they arrived here, if you see the Daily Mail headlines at that time, and if you see when the migrants started to come in the mid-2010s, if you see the language of Daily Mail at that time, you'll see remarkable similarity. So again, these are two heinous types of racism. What I find it really problematic in modern time, that is one type of racism. I do not want to undermine anti-Semitism under any circumstances. It is heinous and it is increasing and it is really, really alarming. But one type of hatred and one type of discrimination, one type of racism is amplified. For example, when the Golders Green attack took place, rightfully there was huge response. And you can see that there was a Cobra meeting and the media was all over it. How much have you heard about the coverage when someone in Edinburgh attacked 5 Muslims and saying anti-Muslim, direct anti-Muslim language, calling Muslims the B word and the F word? No one would raise an eyebrow when that takes place. That's why Edinburgh attack, there was a report saying that the mention was, I think, compared to 58 times to 700 something times. I can't give the exact figure compared to Golders Green. And I do not want to compare. Both are terrible incidents.
I want to conclude by, as I usually like to in these interviews, by asking you about your personal experience. Have you experienced being a target of Islamophobia? How did that sort of experience, or the experience of people around you, influence what you do and how you think as a scholar, as somebody who has a role in society to try to clarify and illuminate?
Okay, thank you for asking this. I did face Islamophobia a long time ago. Direct Islamophobia in recent times. Perhaps the sector I work in, I don't travel by public transport a lot. I personally haven't experienced much in recent times, but I remember I came to the UK in 2004, and then in 2006, I was actually working in London at the time, and I was on the tube on the 7/7 anniversary, first 7/7 anniversary, and someone looked at me and at my bag and said, "Are you carrying a bomb?" But interestingly,
how did you feel? How did you feel at that moment?
I was shocked. I was just stunned. I couldn't say anything, but thankfully there were people around him, and really supported me, and that showed that the common British public.
That's encouraging.
Common British public, but. Something that painful what happened, because I moved into an area in Chigwell, Essex at that time. And we actually faced quite a few, for example, even younger boys threw stones at us. I was walking with my two young girls and they threw stone at us, but thankfully it didn't hit us. And my children really got really scared. That was around 2006-07. And then in 2009 around, I just moved to Manchester, and my daughter wearing hijab in her school, she was asked by another boy, "Are you carrying a bomb under your hijab?" So these types of things my children faced. And in recent times, there hasn't been much.
That's really interesting. And I'm sorry that those things have happened to you. My question, I guess, is you are in this very peculiar role of being an academic, and I guess one brings to scholarship one's experience and one's hopes and one's fears and one's concerns, and I just wonder how easily you found working in the way that you do in finding a path that allows you to be both a good scholar but also somebody who has passionate values.
Yeah, I think these are, your own experience also molds you, helps you grow, helps you do your own stuff. Originally, I have a linguistic background, and coming to the UK and working in the academia, my first few years, I worked on particularly multilingualism, child language acquisition, and all these were the areas I worked most. But I gradually started facing Islamophobia myself. It helped me start to understand Islamophobia more and started to get interest in that, because media was always my interest. My PhD was on language of advertising, and I got into the media representation side of Islamophobia, and my first book, Religion in the Media, Linguistic Analysis, and then the recent one, Media Language on Islam and Muslims, Terminologies and Their Effects, all came up from that understanding that this is an area I need to work more on. There are, of course, other scholars doing great work, but as a linguist, I haven't seen a lot of work looking at the language in terms of how the media use language to manifest Islamophobia. So that is where I come from. So in that way, my scholarship also came from my background, my experience, my understanding, and that misunderstanding of Islam that has come up, and how the media misrepresented, how the politicians also use political rhetoric again, in that way to amplify. And you see the politics media nexus in that side. So these are the ways I brought my research into this dimension. And, for example, my recent article that is going to be published soon, it is in print. It was about Islamophobia in popular culture, the famous BBC TV drama Bodyguard. And I used, and the gendered Islamophobia is the article about how that Bodyguard TV series showed gendered Islamophobia. So I continue to work in this area to create awareness, create scholarly works, and of course, when you create scholarly works, it gets more people get to do it, more people work on it. This is the only way we can work, right? And of course, if I sometimes speak to the media or speak to people like yourself, we talk about this and try to make people aware and understand. And of course, in my classes also, because these things come up in my lectures and seminars.
Well, I look forward to reading the article you just referred to. And I thank you very much for being so clear in explaining how you understand Islamophobia, where it comes from, what its consequences are. And all of that, I hope, adds to what we're trying to do here, which is to understand that words have consequences and political language is never neutral and has the potential, in fact, to be quite hurtful. So thank you very much indeed, Salman Al-Azami, for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak on this subject, which I'm very passionate about.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders.
I know people at home are fed up with politics. I hear you, and I want to be honest with you. We have not been good enough, and we need to be better.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.